Oh, Samuel, that's a great question, Samuel. Yeah, really this kind of pastoral, this really sort of alludes to Calvin and the pastoral interview, which in essence, to answer that question, Samuel, I think in essence it did seek to replace the priest's role as confessor. Now remember, obviously the priest's role is very much central to the Roman Catholic sacrament of penance. And so obviously when the penitential system is utterly rejected by the reformers, we also remember Luther, we remember Calvin from last week, retaining some kind of a constructive role for that type of relationship, that type of private confession, with the qualification that, number one, it was not mandatory. Number two, it's completely and totally separate from the sacrament of penance, which they all rejected. So this kind of individualized, what we may call pastoral interview, pastoral counseling, in many ways did seek to reappropriate what many of the reformers thought were maybe the advantages and really the positive benefits of an individualized confession to a priest, but then shorn of a lot of the other abuses and a lot of the theological problems, especially as associated with the whole notion of merit, works of satisfaction, and the removal of punishment by the work of satisfaction, things like that. Because what they're all wanting to do at this point, whether it be Luther, which we saw in his in the order of private confession, that is in his small catechism. What we even saw with Calvin in his use of the private pastoral interview before the Lord's Supper. Well, we see Perkins here sort of reappropriating that same kind of idea. All right, there is a spiritually beneficial role for the private, we may call counseling session with the pastor. But the purpose of that always, and certainly this would be the case at Perkins, it was always to console the troubled conscience, the oppressed soul, the afflicted soul with the gospel. That was always the purpose. The purpose of this kind of individualized spiritual counseling was always to minister to the troubled conscience, minister to the troubled soul, the afflicted soul, the oppressed soul, with the salutary medicine of the gospel, with the healing medicine of the gospel. That was the purpose. And in sum, they wanted to reform that, what they believed to be that important aspect of the pastoral office. But to reform it, you had to rescue it from the sacrament of penance. So once you do away with the sacrament of penance, you can now reinterpret the pastoral role in that respect as one in which he is consoling the afflicted person with the promises of the gospel. Richard Sibbes, that's it. The bruised reed. That's really what that's all about. That's really what Richard Sibbes' agenda in the bruised reed is all about. It's about consoling the person who is spiritually struggling, and to do so with the gospel. And so here you have Sibbes writing an entire treatise on how to minister to somebody who's that way. So yes, it's really part of a larger what I would call a pastoral reformation. It's a pastoral reformation where we are returning the past, we are reinstating and restoring the pastor's original role in the care of souls. Rescued more or less, liberated more or less from the sacrament of penance and all that entailed. Ethics, morality, that all comes under the larger theme of what we call practical divinity, or what the Puritans would have called practical divinity, which is probably one of the most significant contributions. And yes, whereas on the continent in the 16th century, it was the reformers were seeking to reform the church from the abuses of Catholicism. Here, with respect to the Puritans, the idea was further reformation. So the Puritans have as their agenda the further reformation of an already evangelical church. As a matter of fact, Anthony Milton just came out with a book called the Second Reformation in England, where that's something he argues for very extensively, is that's what the Puritan movement in all of its diverse forms was really about. It was about further reforming an existing church, an existing evangelical national church. And yes, one of the ways in which this would need to be further reformed would be along the lines of pastoral ministry. And certainly we see what Perkins is doing here as one aspect of that. We're going, and he's doing this by example as well. All right, we're going to utilize this idea of the pastor consoling individuals when needed. But number one, it's not going to be mandatory, because remember, going back to the sacrament of penance, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated confession to a priest at least annually. So it's not mandatory. So this is another aspect of the pastoral ministry of which one can avail himself when he needs it, when he is especially spiritually distressed. Well, it depends. I mean, really, it depends on the context. It depends on the specific person. It depends on the specific circumstances and the context. If more often, I mean, if for instance, if we're dealing with the 17th century, for instance, and someone in a Puritan, somebody who's a Puritan is sort of on the wrong side of established authority, and they're being persecuted and all of this as they're on the receiving end of the enforcement of various laws like the Clarendon Code and so forth, depending on what period we're dealing with. Or we go further back to one of the strictures imposed by Laud under the reign of Charles I. Well, then obviously when you're on you're being the perception is you're being persecuted for being faithful, and so therefore, as you are distressed, and as you're tempted to just give up on the whole thing and then just conform, well, then you write one of these Puritan pastors to seek advice. That would be one instance. Other times, as a core, depending on who it is and what the circumstances are, there are individuals who are going through, just as people do today, going through very, very extensive, very sustained spiritual difficulty. We may call it despondency. We may call it depression. We may call it an oppressed conscience. And so, in that regard, a certain Puritan pastor, be it Perkins, be it anyone else, has a reputation for being very astute in pastoral ministry. And for some reason, this individual in their parish church in a distant town isn't necessarily receiving the spiritual help that they think that they need. They would write somebody like a Perkins or someone like that, or a Flavel or someone like that, or a Sibbs, because of their reputation, because the reputation, even nationally, at some point would precede them by way of their published works and things like this. So all that to say is, of course, there'd be a number of reasons why people would write various letters to various Puritans, but again, it's going to depend on the specific context and the specific circumstances. Now, since you brought this up, let me also comment that we know a lot about Puritan introspection. We know a lot about it because there are literally, both in England and in New England, in the United States, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of personal journals to which we have access that are in various archives, in libraries, both in England and in places like in the United States, places like Massachusetts or Connecticut. And so, because we have these hundreds and hundreds of journals, we're able to read of the spiritual journeys and struggles and insights of individual Puritans. And here in this case, when I'm using the word Puritan, I mean both average churchgoers who would self-identify with the Puritans, as well as Puritan ministers themselves. And so all that to say that there is the Puritans as a whole, both in the late 16th and certainly in the 17th century, produce an entire spiritual theology that has to do with things of that nature. And one of the primary sources that we have, which give us insight into their internal life, are their diaries, are their journals, of which there are hundreds. And so, based on those kinds of considerations, and then we compare those to the published sermons of Puritan pastors, to treatises like that of Sibbs or others, well, then we're able to kind of put two and two together, and we're able to see, oh, okay, these are the kinds of specific spiritual problems that these Puritan pastors are trying to address. Because again, as I said, we have direct access oftentimes to what many Puritans are thinking in terms of their own introspection, because they write about all this in their journals, in their personal journals. And again, as I said, of which there are hundreds. Does that help in any way? So yeah, it depends. So so much of this is according to everyone else. All of this depends on context and the specific circumstances of the individual, and then certainly the pastor himself in question. All these individuals, whether they be whether it be Calvin or Butzer or Bullinger on the continent, or any of the English reformers, or in this case the Puritans, they were all Augustinian. That's one thing we have to keep in mind in terms of their understanding of soteriology, in terms of their understanding of salvation. They're all Augustinian. Well, what do I mean by that in this case? Well, in this particular case, Augustine believed in the visible church being mixed. And he bases this on his interpretation of Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares. So he would say, just as you have the wheat, just as the wheat and the tares grow together, and initially one does not really know the difference. So in the visible church, which in this context would also refer to the Christian society. So in this Christian commonwealth, in this Christian society, you have the wheat and the tares, the regenerate, the unregenerate, coexisting together. And then also another factor here that has to be considered is election. So the Spirit of God will regenerate whom He's going to regenerate. He's going to regenerate the elect. Now again, we don't know who the elect are. We don't know ultimately who's regenerate and who's not. And so therefore, not knowing who is and who isn't, especially in a Christian society, well then what you want to do is have them in church so they will be exposed to the means of grace, because somehow through the means of grace the Spirit of God will regenerate. Now the Puritans themselves, since we're on this subject, the Puritans themselves had different views on conversion. Now this itself has been the subject of massive body of literature. There are, especially in the 17th century, there were some Puritans who believe that you had to have some initial period of doubt, of struggling with the reality and the gravity of your sin and so forth, before you experience conversion. There are other Puritans who didn't believe that. So you see, that's another piece of that puzzle as well, Mikey, is that certainly the Puritans, being Augustinian, did not believe that everyone in the Christian society was regenerate. But going back to Augustine, they would say, just like Jesus' parable of the wheat and tares, you have people in the Christian society who are truly regenerate, who aren't. Some elect, some aren't. So since we don't know who is and who isn't, let's be sure for the well-being of the entire society, we expose everybody to the means of grace. And then the Spirit of God will sovereignly do His part. The Spirit of God will sovereignly regenerate those who are elect. It is a challenge to process, because this is an experience that's very, very different from our own. And then you see this being carried out even more so in places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, all throughout the 17th century. Go ahead, James. But among the Puritans, there are these different views of conversion. So probably one of the most radical of these would be Thomas Shepard, who preached a series of sermons. He was in New England on the 10 virgins. And if you want to be depressed, I'm not kidding. If if you want to be absolutely depressed and hurled into some kind of spiritual crisis regarding assurance, just go ahead and read that. But Thomas Shepard would be one of the radical component advocates of the necessity of this preparatory stage for conversion. So you have to have this preparatory stage of conversion where you are really, really being confronted with the reality of your sin. You're struggling with your sin as this preparatory stage for eventual conversion. And then it's interesting when you read some of the extant minutes of elder meetings in New England, where somebody who is going to be given access to the Lord's table, because that was the essence of church membership, is that you're given access to the Lord's table. Well, you then come to a certain point. You come to a certain point in which you give an account of your conversion experience before the elders, and in many cases, depending on which church we're dealing with, which group of elders we're dealing with, there are accounts given by people in some of these minutes where they're describing that preparatory stage, and that preparatory stage can last a very long time before that final state of conversion. And then you find the same kinds of things being described. You find the same kinds of things then being described in the various journals as well. Now, the Puritans were not, as I said, not agreed on this. There were some Puritans who held to that, some who didn't, as Ferguson also states. Just a while ago, if you don't mind me being a little personal here, just a little while ago, I had read Pilgrim's Progress to my son. It took us a while. It took us a while to get through it, but we did. But as I was reading through that again, I came across that, and Brian, I'm inclined to think that Bunyan holds to some aspect of this kind of a preparatory. This kind of a preparatory stage that's somehow allegedly necessary as a prerequisite to conversion. But arguably that's also that does represent sort of an aberration of Reformed practice up to this point, because you read in Calvin. You see this with Calvin. You see it with Butzer. You see it with Bullinger. You see it with most of the Elizabethan reformers, including Perkins. And that is, if you simply embrace the gospel, or if you embrace Christ as Lord and Savior as proclaimed in the gospel, period, you are saved. There's nothing amongst the Elizabethan reformers or any of the English reformers. There's nothing. You don't see it in Perkins. At least I don't believe you see it in Perkins, where somehow there has to be this necessary preparatory stage where you're struggling, where you are just you're just conscientiously and vehemently struggling with sin and the reality of your sin and your state before God and all this before then you're finally converted. You don't find any of that with the 16th century reformers. You don't find any of that, at least in my observation, with the English reformers either. Go ahead, Michael. Remember, there's the slough of despond. Shortly after getting through the wicket gate, Christian falls into the slough of despond. Well, that does correspond with his grace abounding to the chief of sinners. And I think what's really helpful in that regard, if somebody's really interested, is to read the Pilgrim's Progress parallel to Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Because, and I agree with you, because really, arguably, the Pilgrim's Progress is an allegorical description of Bunyan's own life, of his own conversion. I would not necessarily say that Bunyan is trying to universalize that for everyone else, but just in my opinion, I think it is more or less of an allegorical portrayal of Bunyan's own life. And certainly that would make sense given where he is at the time he's writing. He's in jail for 10 years for having violated the Clarendon Code, preaching without a license from the bishop. I mean, there's no way that a bishop is going to let some tinker, some former tinker, go out and preach. So, yeah, so that would make sense. So obviously, as he's in jail, Bunyan is thinking very deeply about his life, his Christian life, and certainly when you consider what happens when Christian and his companion are in Vanity Fair, and what happens to them, they get thrown in prison in Vanity Fair. I'm pretty much convinced that is kind of parallel to what he's experiencing in prison at the time that he's writing it. Are there any other questions at this point? If not, there's an aspect of his pastoral practice I want us to look at, and this has to do with his practical application of doctrine. See, as Perkins was a pastor, and again, just as we saw last week with people like Luther, with people like Calvin, even the English reformers, yes, even Archbishop Cranmer, although on a national scale, all these individuals viewed themselves first and foremost as pastors, and that certainly was no different with Perkins. So Perkins was definitely an accomplished theologian, a major theologian in his own right. However, for Perkins, theology, what we may call academic theology, always served a pastoral end. And that brings us to this other feature of his pastoral ministry, and that has to do with his practical application of doctrine. Perkins sought to wed the doctrine of predestination, for instance, with practical experiential living. So, in this regard, Perkins refused very simply to see the relationship between God's sovereignty and human responsibility as antagonistic. But in his words, they were friends who need no reconciliation. Now, at this point, what I'd like us to do, let me check the time here. What I'd like us to do is just take a couple of minutes. You're all studying theology here, right? Okay, so let me ask this question very quickly before I have us do this. What areas of what we may call systematic theology have you studied thus far? Help me out. Soteriology. All right, what else? Theology proper. What else have you studied so far? All right, ecclesiology. What else? I'm sorry. Eschatology. Yes. All right. Academic theology. Now, have you guys studied Christology? Okay. All right. Good. But what you've studied so far gives us a pretty good basis to work upon which we can build. Now, gentlemen, you have all studied, as you've just confirmed, aspects of academic theology. You've read systematic theology textbooks. I'm sure you've had, I imagine as pastoral students, you've had all kinds of discussions about these things. I'm sure maybe even I'm sure maybe even some debates. So you have a pretty good handle, I would suspect, as pastoral students on these areas of theology that you've studied. However, what is the purpose? And I'm not asking this question to be a smart aleck. I'm asking this question to make a point. What's the purpose of a pastor's college? Could help. That's right. In other words, gentlemen, you're not just sitting here going through an academic exercise. You are not. You didn't take all those theology courses just simply to become academic experts in those areas. You took, as those preparing for the pastorate, you've taken those courses with the view that somewhere along the way, you're going to make use of those doctrines that you've studied in pastoral ministry. So here's what I'd like you to do. Let me check the time here. Just each of you discuss between yourselves what of the types of doctrines that you've studied. Pull out a doctrine from theology proper. You know what you've studied. What aspect of theology proper? What aspect of ecclesiology? What aspect of eschatology and so forth? What is a doctrine within those subjects in systematic theology can you use even specifically for some kind of pastoral practice? What I'd like you to do is spend couple minutes discussing between yourselves, between your groups. What I want you to do is, of all the theology courses you've taken thus far, what I'd like you to do is, between yourselves, decide together on one aspect of a doctrine that you've studied, whether it be in ecclesiology, whether it be in eschatology, whether it be in whether it be theology proper, whether it be soteriology, obviously. Discuss between yourselves that doctrine and how you can apply it practically to your pastoral ministry. That's great, Faisal. Thank you for that. And if I may just add to that too, if you're using that the Isaiah passage, especially the Isaiah 6 passage, to pastorally apply the doctrine of God's holiness, another important aspect of that passage I would use pastorally in this regard is the fact that here is, you're absolutely right, here is Isaiah, self-righteous, in the temple of all places, being confronted with the absolute, infinite holiness of God, where, again, in being so confronted, he acknowledges his inherent sinfulness, as you pointed out, where he says, "Woe is me, for I am unclean, and I dwell among a people. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips." But then remember what happens, and I think you hinted at this somewhat. Remember, the angel takes one of the coals from the altar and touches his lips with it. Now, what effect, at least according to the passage, what effect does that have? So you see, from a pastoral standpoint, this is, yes, God's holiness, as you're absolutely right. God's infinite and absolute holiness confronts our own sinfulness. But yet, when we despair of our state in light of that, which then brings about repentance, then God, by his grace, like the angel who touches Isaiah's lips with that coal, makes us holy in his sight. And having made us so holy, by the power of his Spirit indwelling us, we are therefore enabled, because of what Christ has done for us, to live in holiness and to increase in it. Thank you. Okay, Brian and Muhammad. Very good. Now, I just have a question, though. I mean, one thing you're highlighting is that, yes, as Christians, there should be, by God's grace, an eschatological dimension to how we live our lives. We live our lives in view of Christ coming again. And yes, as you illustrated, Muhammad, at the time of the judgment, yes, there is going to be that separation between the sheep and the goats, and certainly there is that evangelistic, very important evangelistic aspect of it. But also, let me ask this question, just as a follow-up. How do we apply a passage like that pastorally to a Christian without having it come off as being somewhat performance-based? Okay, all right, I've got to be faithful. Oh, here I'm listening to this. I have to be faithful. I've got to be faithful in this way. Oh boy, because if I'm not faithful in this way, if I don't use my talents or whatever other resources God has given me in this way, oh boy, I'm going to end up like that. I'm going to end up like that guy who buried the talent and ends up being consigned to where people are weeping and wailing and gnashing their teeth and so forth. So my question is, gentlemen, how would you pastorally apply that to a Christian in such a way that it's not coming off as legalistic, moralistic, performance-based? When Christ comes again, man, he's going to view me. He's going to regard me on the basis of how much I did, what I didn't do, and so forth. So that would be my question, gentlemen. How would you apply those passages pastorally in that way so as to not come off in that vein? Thank you, Brian. Very well done. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you both. Thank you both. Admittedly, that passage especially, it is a difficult passage to somehow pastorally apply with respect to the final judgment. But I think both of you, I think, have handled that. Have shown that you've handled that pretty well. So I want to commend you on that. But we always see that one of the important aspects of the judgment from a pastoral standpoint is that it's the time also when Christ himself, as our Lord, our Savior, and our Redeemer, fully vindicates us. And really, I think that's another important aspect, and I think you've hit on this too. That's an important aspect of the sheep and goats judgment in Matthew 25, is that when he speaks to the sheep, he's also vindicating them. He's vindicating them as his. And because they are his, because of what he has done, they've evidenced that reality in the various things that they did. So thank you. Appreciate that. Mikey and Michael.
Good.
That's great. Thank you. It's always important, for ourselves, and also those to whom we're ministering, to remind them that Christ is an infinitely greater Savior than we are sinners. That's something we should always keep in mind, and it should always be at the forefront. And I think you, and Mikey, I think you illustrated this very well, but I'm just kind of pulling it together here. That should be at the forefront for ourselves, and certainly we always need to make that front and center to those to whom we're ministering, that Christ is an infinitely greater Savior than we are sinners. Thank you. Okay, Issachar and Emmanuel. That's great. Thank you. The importance of citizenship in the kingdom by participating in the life of the church, because the local church. You're absolutely right. The local church is an outpost of the kingdom. And so if we're citizens of the kingdom of God, which the prerequisite for which obviously is regeneration, well then, if we're part of the kingdom of God, then we're going to participate in that through the life of the church. Very good, thank you. And what you've all done here is, by way of this exercise, you've all demonstrated what Perkins was doing. You've all demonstrated in some way how theology serves a practical pastoral purpose. And that should be and this also, and what you've demonstrated here and what Perkins demonstrated, and we wanted to apply what he was doing in our pastoral practice, is this discredits, if we're going to put this in negative terms, this discredits the whole notion that theology is impractical. And oftentimes, again, I don't know, again, gentlemen, I would be interested in your input on this, because I'm not sure about Ethiopia, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily the case in this part of the world. But I do know in other places there is this radical dichotomy. There's a false dichotomy that's created between theology and the so-called practical. And so oftentimes what happens is in pastoral practice, somebody comes to a passage of Scripture. They may care to exegete it, they may not, and then suddenly it just serves as just sort of a launching pad into a whole list of how-tos, and those how-tos may or may not have any relationship with the text. And the bridge, one of the bridges, gentlemen, between sustained scriptural exposition and then the application of that scriptural exposition to the life of those entrusted to us is theology, is our systematic theology. And so always as pastors, and this is what Perkins' example shows us. Always, gentlemen, be thinking theologically. Be thinking theologically, but then be thinking theologically in terms of how that theology is going to address and relate directly to the spiritual needs of the people committed to your charge. But again, it's multifaceted, it's all intertwined. The scripture study, theology, knowing the lives of the people to whom you're ministering. And so, therefore, Perkins, in this regard, gives us a great example of what it means to be a pastor theologian. That's what you are. That's what you're preparing to be. You are preparing to be pastor theologians. What you're going to be doing is as pastors. Even if that ministry takes on a more explicitly evangelistic characteristic, what you're going to be doing at the end of the day is you're going to be doing theology in a pastoral setting. That's the essence of what you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing theology in a pastoral setting, and your theological thinking and growing, as we've just demonstrated, is going to play such a role where, in relation to your scriptural exposition and all of that, and you're dealing with people on a personal level by way of pastoral care, that theology is always going to be living and breathing and is going to always dynamically relate to the people to whom you're ministering. That's what it means, gentlemen, by God's grace and by the power of His Spirit, to do theology in a pastoral setting. That's what you're being prepared here for, and that ultimately, in God's good providence, is what you're going to do. You're not the CEO. You're not the CEOs of some kind of, I don't know what I would call it, some kind of religious plant or some kind of complex. No. You are shepherds who are also theologians. And if you approach your ministry that way, prayerfully by God's grace, God, again, by His grace, is going to use that powerfully. Now, we have a few minutes here, so let me just try and finish up this section. And that is another important aspect, and hopefully we'll be getting into this part. We'll be getting to some of this part of it after lunch. But another important aspect of Perkins' ministry was that he pioneered what we call Puritan casuistry. What on earth is that? Well, this addresses directly, really, the concerns, Issachar, that you raised earlier. Casuistry was the art of dealing with cases of conscience by self-examination and scriptural diagnosis. That's casuistry. And Perkins was a pioneer in that enterprise. And this really becomes one of the distinguishing characteristics of the Puritans, was the work that they did in what we call casuistry, which is this whole matter of dealing with these cases of a person's conscience by way of self-examination, and things like, as you pointed out, Issachar, earlier, things like despondency, things like discouragement and so forth, and then providing a scriptural diagnosis and a scriptural solution. Now, in another context, we could call this, at the risk of sounding anachronistic, but I'll just use it for our purposes here, this does amount to something of what we might call early biblical counseling. So Perkins engaged in this not just with respect to dealing with people individually, going back to counseling students individually about their spiritual lives, but he also but this approach also was evident in his preaching as well. But you see, that also implies, as we said earlier, that Perkins intimately knew the lives of the people committed to his charge as a pastor. And so many people, therefore, were convicted of sin and delivered from bondage under his preaching. Now, as I said, there's a good. I have a little bit of an excerpt from his cases of conscience. We'll discuss that in a little bit. Obviously it'll be after lunch that we get into that. But I just wanted to just wanted us to know here that this is probably one of the things for which Perkins, as a pastor, and we'll just say as a pastoral theologian, is best known, is his really laying the groundwork for what other Puritans would do in this area of casuistry, this whole matter of cases of conscience being subject to a very rigid scriptural diagnosis, and then self-examination prior to that, and so forth. Now, I want to close with this story of how Perkins was used in the conversion of a prisoner before we adjourn for lunch. Samuel Clarke, a later biographer of Perkins, tells us the story of a condemned prisoner who was climbing the gallows, looking half dead, when Perkins said to him, now this is the guy who's been convicted of some kind of a capital crime. He's going to the gallows to be hanged. That's what's going on. So this guy is on his way to be executed. So Perkins sees this convicted criminal who's been sentenced, and now he's about to receive the death penalty by hanging. So when Perkins sees him, he says, "What, man? What is the matter with you? Are you afraid of death?" The prisoner confessed that he was less afraid of death than of what would follow it. "Say you so," said Perkins. "Come down again, man, and you shall see what God's grace will do to strengthen you." So when the prisoner came down, this prisoner who's on his way to be executed kneels down with Perkins, hand in hand. And Perkins offered, as Samuel Clarke tells us, quote, "such an effectual prayer and confession of sins as made the poor prisoner burst out into an abundance of tears." So the convinced prisoner was brought, quote, "low enough to hell's gates." Perkins then showed him the gospel in prayer. Clarke then goes on to write that the prisoner's eyes were opened to, quote, "see how the black lines of all his sins were crossed and canceled with the red lines of his crucified Savior's blood, so graciously applying it to his wounded conscience, has made him break out into showers of tears for joy of the inward consolation which he found." So, with that dramatic experience having taken place, the prisoner rose from his knees, went cheerfully up the ladder, testified of salvation in Christ's blood, and bore his death with patience. Quote, as if he actually saw himself delivered from hell, which he feared before, and heaven opened for the receiving of his soul, to the great rejoicing of the beholders. There is an account of how Perkins' pastoral ministry, by the grace of God and by the power of his Holy Spirit, made a difference even in the conversion of a convicted criminal walking to his own execution.